you joined, and also some other educational things from Finland to that region. And then welcome Kristi Gryzhakov from Tallinn. Kristi is a researcher in TalTech, the Technical University of Tallinn, and finalizing a PhD at the moment in Aalto University. Kristi, do you want to briefly say hello to the audience?
Hello. Great to be here and talk about the Estonian experiences and the projects we have doing with the shrinking context there.
Yes, we have been collaborating already quite a while. There is an interesting set of actions from ministries, from regions, and from municipalities. Definitely, shrinkage is a quite big issue in Estonia, and in some sense, in policy, Estonia is even in more advanced level. In Finland, we can learn something. So we are having very interesting setup. Netherlands, Belgium, Estonia, and Finland. Antti Saloniemi, please join them. Start. I think we have lost Antti, but anyway, Antti.
You are mute.
Sorry.
Ah, yes.
Oh,
Please,
everyone.
yeah. Welcome.
Yes, I'm Antti Saloniemi. I'm a professor of sociology in the University of Tampere, and fitting well in this situation from the side campus of Pori. Pori is an old industrial place in west coast of Finland, which has been suffering about decline of industry since mid-70s. Right.
Yes, great. Welcome and welcome our audience. As said, use them chat for questions. We will record both or take note on them comments and questions in chat. And if it's okay for all speakers, Raul would record the lectures. I hope so. The program is Maurice Ehrmanns. The Antistadt city is growing smaller. Starting now, then we have questions to Maurice and short break around maybe 5 past 6, and then Kristi Gryzhakov will start about 15 past 6, and then we can have a concluding discussion with speakers, with Antti and with all of you who are joining. So we have a open floor discussion after 7. And we end latest at 8. Good. Maurice, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Panu. I will try to share my screen. Let me see. Whoa. Like this. Okay. So everything needs to change, and do we really need growth? So basically, like Panu already introduced, I'm looking into cities growing smaller, and specifically, I am interested in the fact that cities that do not grow anymore are actually pioneers of a society that is not fundamentally based on principles of growth. I'm working currently at 2 projects. First, the Internationale Bauausstellung, Parkstad. And secondly, I'm working on my next book, which will be an English version of the Antistadt. And so I would like to thank Sophie and Panu for inviting me, because your topic is very much also the topic I've been working for in the last 10 or 15 years. So, but first, to give you some form of orientation, the IBA Parkstad and the region I work and live is well, the Netherlands has this sort of strange appendix in the southeast, and it's actually between Germany and Belgium. I think the smallest part is only 10 kilometers. So the region where I live is actually bordered by foreign countries for 75%. I think so. We have a lot of influence by the Rhineland, of course. Cologne is only 1 hour away, while Amsterdam is 2.5 hours away. So I think there's a lot of influence in our area by these neighbors. And Parkstad is actually characterized by, perhaps you know him, a German scholar, Thomas Sievers, named this as a Zwischenstadt, so an in-between city. So it's not the typical dense classical European walled university city with a lot of historical buildings, but actually a more modern, an Industrie Neustadt, industrial new town, which is characterized by polycentric structures and a lot of green. And so it looks like this. So we call this regiopolitan areas, actually. It's one of the topics of the IBA Parkstad, as opposed to metropolitan areas. So regiopolitan areas have actually different qualities, characteristics, different city life than metropolises. And we believe that they have a lot of potential when it comes to contemporary challenges like climate change, extreme weather, local food production, etc., etc. And so this is actually also the main city of the Dutch mining industry. In my city, in this region, 9 mining sites were located, but they only produced mines until 1974, which is, for European standards, one of the first, I think, countries that definitely closed its mining industry. And that was, of course, because we found a huge bubble of gas in the very north of the Netherlands. So we had the luxury to change already our energy supplies very early. But it now gives a sort of strange situation that whereas the Dutch government is promoting to stop the use of gas and transforming to other more green uses, across the border, only 10 kilometers from here, the German government is actually promoting the use of gas and subsidizing, actually. So it's a very strange non-European synchronized policy example. So I wrote this book because, as many former industrialized areas, the area got depressed after the industry was closed. And after the depression, of course, a result of the depression is, of course, that many young people are looking for better places with perhaps more perspective, perhaps where city life is more pulsating, cities with universities. So in the 80s and 90s, Parkstad became a shrinking urban region. Actually, one of the first, well, not quite, because Amsterdam used to be a shrinking city also in the 70s, losing almost 100,000 people. So, but in the 90s, of course, a period where a lot of cities were revitalizing and growing in popularity. It's at least until 10 years ago, the very phenomenon of a shrinking city was sort of seen as an anomaly. And so in the growing popularities of city, why is it that shrinking cities exist? Because people in general want to live in cities. So growing smaller is actually the challenge for these cities, but also more broadly. So what does it mean for a city to grow smaller? What does it mean for architecture? And so one of the things I think is interesting is that a shrinking city, because it has often a challenge of demolishing buildings that are superfluous, that are too much. So what we see in Pakistan, for example, is that there is a growing need of landscape architecture. But also, of course, the reuse of materials, the reuse of buildings. But as I said in my introduction, A Shrinking City is, in my view, also a pioneer for a society that also has to deal with the fact that growth is not sustainable, at least not in the way that we define it at this moment. So I think we can learn a lot from a city that is not growing anymore. So what I would like to do in my presentation is to present a project that I did last year, a research project, in which we sort of connected or issued a confrontation or a meeting, if you wish, between the degrowth movement, and I will explain for those of you who are not familiar with this, I will explain it a bit, and what this movement, their ideas, their concepts, their theories could mean for the city. And so the degrowth movement, actually their basic question is how to cope with the lack of growth is the most important issue that Western governments face in this time and age. And also their proposition is that growth in this form is no longer sustainable nor desirable. And it's also likely to be coming to an end sooner or later. So this degrowth is actually, if you look at the network and the people that are involved in it, it's actually basically an economic discussion. So they question actually the very economic system that our society is based on. It's not a very focused community. It's a very broad range of colorful ideas, thoughts, and activities. And if you would have to give a definition of this, then I would say it's a normative discourse to question the fixation on growth and all societal domains and the plea for reducing production and consumption as a means to achieve environmental sustainability, social justice, and well-being, as well as questioning the system and context within which growth takes place. So it's very broad. And as I was looking into this, this community and their literature, because a lot of literature is being produced around this topic, I was surprised by the lack of literature on cities, and especially on shrinking cities. So, and maybe this, just to add a bit, so of course the degrowth thinking is not something which is new. It's really rooted in, for example, Lefebvre, Latouche, the Club of Rome, and recently also Raworth. So, and if you look at the concepts and practices that you will find within this community, you will also find already known practices like cooperative housing, basic income, frugal lifestyles, eco-villages. So practices and ideas like that. And actually degrowth tries to sort of put them together. So what does degrowth mean for the shrinking city? So, like I said, I was quite surprised that within the degrowth literature, not so much has been said on the city, let alone on the shrinking city. Because in my understanding, I would say that a shrinking city could be an inspiration for people who are involved in thinking on how to achieve a society based on principles of degrowth, because a shrinking city already is a reality of degrowth. A shrinking city needs to think on urban development without without standard principles of growth. So in my opinion, this would be an interesting area to look into. So in our research project, we asked ourselves, can urban degrowth practices contribute to a long-term perspective for urban development in cities or shrinking cities? The second question, can shrinking cities be conceptualized as testing grounds for degrowth perspectives and practices in urban planning and development? Because they are already facing a reality without demographic and often economic growth. And we said to ourselves, okay, what is a good way to address these two questions? And so I said, well, let's make a newspaper. Let's make a newspaper called the Degrowth Daily. And so I would like to take you along on not only the process, but also the contents of this newspaper, and also the findings of the research project. So our basic idea was to make a crowdsourced newspaper. A newspaper, a thematic newspaper on the topic of degrowth and the shrinking city. And actually our goal was to transfer the theory and ideology that's behind a lot of the degrowth literature to the practice, to the daily practice of a city, of a shrinking city. So, and hence the choice of the title, Degrowth Daily. So on the one hand, you have this highly theorized concept of degrowth, the critique on the system, fundamental critique. And we were very curious on how this plays out in the daily life of a shrinking city. And of course, maybe you ask, okay, why a newspaper? Well, first of all, I think a newspaper is a very accessible medium for reaching networks and communities beyond the academic and in this instance, activist networks. Because I think that the degrowth community is maybe not elite, but it's a small community and it's a very academic community. So, and I thought it might be important to get this topic beyond these networks, and a newspaper is actually a very suitable medium to do this. Second, I think a newspaper is also open for different forms of storytelling, not only textual, but also visual, graphics. We also even had a horoscope, but you can also have puzzles. So a newspaper is very suitable to involve different ways of telling the story. So I think this contributed to the accessibility also of introducing the topic. Okay, a newspaper, and then how do you go about? Because a newspaper is never made alone. So we started to organize a focus group. Did I? No, yes, I didn't skip a slide. And basically what we did in this focus group was to actually define the very focused research questions that would be the basic of the newspaper. And secondly, as you know, normal newspaper is very structured. So you have different elements and different topics that are sort of structuring the newspaper. So we also defined the different structures of the newspaper. The next step was, of course, to organize an open call, because our aim was to have a big diversity of people to contribute to the newspaper. So we had to reach also a broad, diverse group of people. So we had to make some noise. And we not only made some noise, but we also tried to communicate the bandwidth of what the newspaper has to offer. So instead of asking contributors to deliver an article, we actually challenged them to also think of different forms, advertisements, illustration, photographic essay, an interview, a cartoon. I mean, that's the advantage of newspaper, it all fits. But we also communicated the structure and the different teams of what contributions could deliver. So we made also some propaganda. And the final, so at the 5th of June, the newspaper was published, and the 5th of June is Global Degrowth Day. And then last month, we organized the Degrowth Daily Live, in which we presented, of course, the outcome, the newspaper, and also a selection of contributors. So, and what did we get? So we got 30 contributors from 3 countries, and we had a very multidisciplinary perspective on the topic and our research questions, not only from professionals, but also from non-professionals, from academics, non-academics, citizens. So I think our goal to get the topic out of this very small academic circle was achieved. And so let me take you to the content of the Degrowth Daily and give you some examples of contributions to this topic. So first, we structured the newspaper in 7 different categories. Binnenstad, buitenstad, which is actually growing city, non-growing city, city nature, the built city, and the lived city, which is actually a reference to the latest book of Richard Sennett, city nature, and the political city. I see that I have 2, I doubled one of them. So let me give you some examples of the contributions. So first, which I was very glad, was a contribution from Thüringen in Germany, from Frank Eckert and his colleagues. He published the book Postwachstumsstadt. And he conceptualized, he not only conceptualized the city, how does a city look like after growth, but he also included a lot of relevant examples of how this plays out. So, and we were able to also use his graphics and publish part of his book. So, which is a basically theoretical contribution to the newspaper, but that was fine with us. The second example that I would like to give to you is from a Belgian architectural firm, which is called Rest. And Rest is actually, well, I'm not sure if I have to translate it. It's rest, which is what is left over. And they are very interesting because they published a book with the title "The Gains or the Gain of Not Building." So this architectural firm is actually only doing projects where no building is involved. And in their publication, they published a sort of manifesto with 10 points why they think that not building, that everything already has been built. Why they think not building is actually the best way to deal with the current situation, and how they actually go about. And that, of course, for architects who are actually educated and trained in building new buildings, I think this is a very interesting point of view. And so we published their manifesto, and they were really willing to work along. So we were very glad to have them included. The third example I would like to mention is a project in the region of Parkstad, which is called Superlocal. So like many shrinking regions, there is also a challenge to rebalance the number of inhabitants and the number of buildings in this region. And so the local governments decided to demolish a number of thousands of residential houses. One of them was situated in the municipality of Kerkrade. And instead of just demolish the buildings, they decided to reuse the material of the old structures. So it's a form of circular demolition, which is quite interesting. And so with these old building materials, they, for example, built these pavilions. So they used the old building materials and they redesigned them, and they started also reusing them. So that's my third example. So, and then it's not an example, but the nice thing of a newspaper is that one contributor, she answered the open call, and she asked whether she could make an astrological chart of Heerlen. So I think that was very interesting. And so she made one based on also historical milestones of the city and of the existence of the city. And so that was, for me, was also a sort of confirmation that the medium of newspaper is very open to different forms of storytelling. So the Degrowth Daily, our research project. So I would like to conclude with some findings. So the first finding, which I particularly find very interesting, is that there is a difference between how degrowth is perceived in growing cities and in shrinking cities. So I noticed that the community of degrowth, the academic community, is mainly situated in growing cities, in Amsterdam, Barcelona, Paris. And so for them, urban degrowth is something that is wanted because they are living in a very dense, urbanized, growing city with growing tourism, etc., etc. So actually, they are very much looking for ways in how this growth can be controlled or channeled. While degrowth in a shrinking city is actually the opposite. In a shrinking city, urban shrinkage is something unwished for. Probably nobody, no politicians, no policymakers, no architects are sort of longing for urban shrinkage. So that also explains why I found out that in a shrinking city, this whole movement of degrowth and the community, it was fairly unknown in at least the shrinking cities that I looked into. So that's also part of the reason that I said, okay, I would like to have this discussion on this topic to go beyond the academic circles and to also transfer it to communities in the shrinking cities. So a second finding, which is maybe an open door, but I think at least our project did some confirmation on this, is that a shrinking city is fit as a testing ground for urban degrowth practices. Because there is obviously space to do some experiments. There is green. There is also an urgency to look for different strategies, because most common strategies that are based on growth are not really working anymore. So at least in the regions I looked into, also politics, but policymakers definitely are really open for alternative strategies to find different ways for urban development to happen when growth is not part of the reality. And so my final finding is then the question, okay, what are urban practices with degrowth characteristics? So how can we define or maybe work towards a definition of urban degrowth practices? And actually in our research, we defined 8 characteristics, and perhaps we can have a discussion on that. So urban degrowth practices. So first, an urban practice should contribute to a diminishing of production and consumption, following a non-capitalist logic, and invest or work with cooperative instead of competitive relations. Experiment with alternative forms of ownership other than the private, for example, non-hierarchical or emancipatory forms of self-organization. And does the urban practice promote social interaction in the public urban space? 6th characteristic, does the urban practice promote different use values? Social, ecological, economic, or cultural. For example, activities involving urban ecology, promoting local food production. Does it promote more equality between market, state, and civic actors? And finally, does it contribute to a culture of degrowth? So does it create symbols and language that attribute meaning to this reality of not growing anymore? So maybe concluding remarks. So part of the concept was also that the newspaper, as we produced the first edition of the Degrowth Daily, and part of the concept was that if another degrowth enthusiast community in a different area would be interested, we are gladly willing to sort of transfer the concept and work with it, and also transfer the design towards this group. And we are currently discussing with a group in Belgium to produce the 2nd edition of the Degrowth Daily. And I hope a next edition will soon come into existence in the future, and maybe some more editions. So that was my contribution, my lecture. You can actually download the Degrowth Daily on degrowthdaily.nl as a PDF. And if you are good in Dutch, I am gladly willing to send a physical copy if you would like to do that. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to any questions or discussions on this topic.
Thank you, Morris. Fantastic work and fantastic material. Indeed, we can have some questions. There is good time to post questions. I don't see questions yet in the chat, but
Anuska is, I think, is waiting.
There is one, but yeah. Before we go, yeah, there's no question coming. Before we go to the question in chat, just one very simple one. I think you framed really interestingly this situation that there is them already actually quite old let's say academic economist debate on degrowth. They started that debate started around the time of Club of Rome in 1970s already, and as you said, it's a very diverse set of ideas, and basically your claim that debate on society and economy never touched the city in general and shrinking city in practice. I think that's a very big claim, and probably quite valid claim, a very interesting claim. So there is theory somewhere and practice reality somewhere in Netherlands, in Estonia, in Pori, in Finland, and so forth. It's very interesting. I think this setting is fantastic. Thinking how we can advance ideas for a big transformation. We're having a situation that theory and practice are there but don't meet. And your work is in a way building that link. I think that's very interesting, in fact. But a concrete question before we go to the questions in chat. Did you ever have a direct contact? Did you talk to these current degrowth proponents, members of that loose group of academics and so forth?
Yes, absolutely. Because like you said, we wanted to organize a meeting actually between the theoretical academic community and the practice of the shrinking cities and the daily reality actually, and we actually invited them. They were part of the focus group that we organized, but they also contributed. So they have. I think 2 or 3 pieces are coming from that network. So part of our goal was to sort of build a bridge between the more theoretical academic network and the practice and the people who are actually working on the city in the daily practice. And I think we succeeded in that. So the Degrowth Daily is also, some people say, well, it's still very theoretical. It's a lot of text, for example, but it's not academic. And we have a lot of examples of urban practices. So I think we succeeded in sort of a first attempt to build a bridge between the theory and the practice. Yes. At least in my vision.
Yeah, great, thanks. Yeah, who wants to start? Anuska, please. Floor is yours.
Hi, Morris, and thank you again for a very nice presentation. And it was 2 years ago we had a chat about this when we had the summer school.
Yes.
And you presented this then, and it was quite new then. Actually, in 2 years' time, a lot has happened, and I think this issue has been raised now in politics, in urban politics, as well as it's clearly coming to the discussions of various researchers. Before it was in the margin, but of course there is this the reason for it that there has been this bottom-up self-organizing movement, like a very strong one, and this capitalism critique and climate change. Now that this all these contribute to this issue to be raised, and now we really need to think about what are the practical solutions and practical tools to work with. I was just wanted to ask you about, did you meet people who thought that this is a very bad idea? For instance, you may think that in socially deprived areas, where people have suffered from lack of resources, lack of funding, lack of interest from the state, that they would like to see growth. So how can you tell to these socially deprived people that no, there is no growth now for you? You know what I mean? I mean, how do you were talking about narratives and symbols. So I think there is quite a difficult question how to narrate this in such a way that people who are not so well off can sort of buy it. That was my question.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a question that is simple to answer, but I think in this region we are already working for 10 or 15 years on having different ideas on a shrinking city. So whereas 15 years ago, the concept or the very idea or notion of shrinking cities was almost similar as being a problem child, a problem city. I think, and of course, in the neoliberal political climate, if you are not growing, then it's also your fault that you are not growing. And so you are a problem or creating a problem maybe yourself. I think this has changed a lot, and certainly the last years, because growth as a concept in general, and also due to the grassroots movements and the activists, is something that is more and more critiqued on. And I think what we have seen in this city, in the Parkstad region, is that from being a problem city, more and more people are seeing it as a testing ground where there is an urge to conduct urban experiments, and urban experiments that are trying new ideas of urban development without commercial investments, for example. But it took maybe 10 to 15 years to have this different notion of a shrinking city. So what I was surprised by is that a lot of people that are working here on urban degrowth practices, not only civilians, but also professionals, they never heard of the theory and concept of degrowth. So they are actually working on practices, urban practices that you might call degrowth practices, but they are not aware of the theoretical concepts that are sort of being developed in mainly growing cities. So these people are working on a pragmatic level with the same ideas that the academics are researching and discussing and debating in growing cities. So I think that's a very interesting notion, because these people are really not interested in theories. They are just coping and dealing with the daily practice of the shrinking city, but also using the opportunities that they are presented with and that are given by shrinking cities, because I think there also are a lot of opportunities.
Yes. Yeah. Do you want to continue? I have one other. Okay, there is actually two different questions, but one is to the topic of this lecture. So of course I sense that your answer to this broad question, do we need growth, is negative. We do not need growth. Am I right in my reading that you would answer that way?
If you would define growth in the way that we have done that for the last decades, I would confirm that we do not need this type of growth. If you define growth on different parameters, social, ecological, cultural, then so it's a matter of how we define growth. I think growth is not only about profit maximization, for example.
Yes.
But in urban development, it's often defined as something that is worth striving for.
Yes. Yeah. There is this already quite old idea that human well-being, in history, it did grow more or less with economic growth, because food and better housing and more culture, because in the past century. And then there is a point when this start to differ. I mean, more economic growth in the old sense, at least, is not meaning more well-being. And I think it's clear that now we have passed that point in Europe, United States, a long time ago, maybe in 70s or 60s already. But yeah, interesting question. When we met before, you had this very interesting comment that if we imagine, urban development, there is always people, of course, residents, users, people who might buy flat or something like that. There is the market, construction companies, landowners, and then there's public sector, cities making plans, taking taxis, providing services. And I recall so clearly that you said that that triangle is broken in the shrinking city because the market has gone away. There's no way to make money. So it's only the public sector and people, the community left. As Anushka said, now already a bit time has gone. Is this a simple interpretation? Is it making any sense to you?
Yes, of course, because when you have a situation where you have a disbalance, where scarcity and surplus is actually reversed, so you have a scarcity on people and a surplus on buildings,
supply space,
and space, the market will become less interested. Because there is an abundance of the product that they actually would like to sell, buildings. But if you look more carefully, I think also within this shrinking city, it's much more differentiated, because you will have areas that are still attractive for people, and you will have areas that are not very much attractive for people. So you will also find, like we have in Europe and the United States, the polarization and the attractive capacity of the growing, mostly capital cities that are attracting talent and finance and etc. And they are actually drawing their talent from the more peripheral areas. You will also find that within a shrinking city, because there will always be attractive neighborhoods and non-attractive neighborhoods. But I think also, at least in the Netherlands, but also in Germany and the Benelux, I think the shrinking cities sort of reach a high point also in conclusion with the economic crisis of 2008. So it fortified the development of a city that is losing inhabitants, but because that crisis also prevented of investments that would normally perhaps be done. So the effects of the crisis were more seen even in cities that were already shrinking. And so in recent years, I think that in at least in the Dutch shrinking cities, you see a sort of, as the growing cities, the popular cities are becoming more expensive and more expensive, they sort of are turning again to the cities that were not on their radar maybe 5-6 years ago. But because the investments in the popular growing cities are maybe too difficult or too high, there is an increasing interest again of the market. And what we also see, for example, in the rural area, in the shrinking cities there, but I think we also see it in the Pakistan region, is of course the effects of the refugee crisis in 2015 and the fact that Romania and Bulgaria got a member of the EU in 2007. So a lot of migrants from these countries are coming to the West with as an effect that many shrinking cities in the rural area are not shrinking anymore, they are growing again. So there are in 5-6 years time, there is different developments and things are changing again, I think.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Of course, it's linked to the different scales. Are we talking about a city or region? I think this idea of the Parkstad and this region of these new towns, instant new towns that are now after 50 years or since 50 years of closing mines in new situation. Then there is still the nation state. What is the growth or decline of the state? We have European Union, and then we have the global market. So there are different scales, making the question of growth quite complex, of course. There is very good discussion in chat. So Emil Tupainen put a very interesting link to Green New Deal without growth, a new article in Ecological Economics. Thanks for that link, Emil. Sounds very interesting. And then we are discussing about sources of this data. I mean, is it in your book? Is it in the Degrowth Daily? As Morris said, this first issue of the daily can be downloaded from the site.nl. But then it's also about exactly this. We continue the discussion about how to communicate, how to create narratives and future visions that will be meaningful to different groups. Is there something? Emil, would you like to kind of pose a question directly, or should we leave in written form?
Yes, sure. I could ask about the first question that I stated was the thing that I was interested that is there like do you, Morris, have some kind of publications where you list these characteristics that you talked about the degrowth in cities? I'm just interested because of my master's thesis, but these sound really interesting.
Not yet, but I hope to publish an article with two of my colleagues from Maastricht University in next year, actually. And I don't know how is your Dutch. They are also published in the newspaper, so if you can read Dutch or understand Dutch, maybe that.
No, I don't understand Dutch, unfortunately. Yeah, so there isn't anything in English.
Not yet.
Yes. Okay. So it's coming soon. Good.
Yes.
Kristi, do you want to comment briefly, or should we have a short break and then continue with your talk in a couple of minutes?
Yes, thank you, Maurice. Super exciting presentation, and I think it's maybe best if we have the short break now and then we continue, because I can definitely already see very many links to what Maurice discussed in his presentation. Of course, I'm not focusing on maybe degrowth as a concept so much, but even how to understand even the shrinkage or what it actually is, or or how do all the different stakeholders actually understand what shrinkage is in this concept. I think it's interesting. Yeah, maybe we can continue to discuss that afterwards then in the discussion, that I think also the terminology is often very confusing. Like you said, that the degrowth is this kind of concept which is debated in the academic communities, and it's often not very clear what it exactly means, and it can be interpreted in very different ways. And with the shrinkage, it's a little bit the same topic, that each of us in our head get a little bit different ideas. And when you were also now discussing, answering the questions and answers, then I just started thinking about this Estonian experience as well, that how many debates we had, for example, with our clients in the ministries, just discussing over words, how we call something in the guideline documents or in the report, or how should we talk to the municipalities about these topics, or what kind of words we use also in our native language and then in English language. So yeah, so this is basically what my comment would be, maybe to begin with, that what I started wondering about.
Great. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Maurice. Very, very interesting presentation, and I'm curious to read the Degrowth Daily myself. I can read Dutch, so I'm okay. I'm initiated enough to do that.
Great.
Let's have a 5-minute break, and we continue 6:15. Raul, can you put them title page or something, so that if there's more people coming, they don't wonder what's happening. I'll close my camera for a second and well, let the dog out in this small place where I'm living. Kristi Kirchkov from Taltech Tallinn, and we already had a brief introduction in the lounge session, so I think we can go straight to your talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I will share the screen. Okay, I hope you see the presentation now.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Estonian experiences of analyzing shrinkage or understanding shrinkage, and also drafting policies for smart shrinkage. And I'm concentrating mainly on the built environment, so the effects of what can be called shrinkage of villages or small towns or bigger cities on built environment. And I'm going to talk about a little bit in the beginning about the context of Estonian from the perspective of population decline, regional development or unequal regional development, and then also the housing structure, because we're mainly going to talk about the residential dwellings in the case of shrinkage. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more detailed about the pilot studies that have been currently finished in East Estonia, which were happening in last year, so 2020, and then also some findings from that or reflections and some next steps which are now being drafted by the different ministries working with the shrinkage topic in Estonia on a national level. First, a little bit about the trends. So how to cope with the lack of growth, meaning also population decline in this context. This is, of course, I think one of the mega trends of the next couple of decades. So if you see here the Espon maps, which were done for the Espon spatial scenarios up to 2050. So this is focused on the Baltic Sea region. Then you see here very clearly that, of course, in the next, by 2030, the situation is not so dire, but by 2050, it is only very few cities and very few regions which are not experiencing very big population decline. So this means that this is a topic, how to deal with the population decline and also then the effects on the built environment. This is a topic which will continue to be relevant in most of the different, not only cities, but as said, also towns and different villages throughout at least the Baltic Sea region in Europe. And I think it's even more relevant than to discuss the shrinkage academically, but also to to discuss also different practices, good practices, but also context-based practices, which would be relevant for very different settlements that are dealing with this issue and do not currently have very varied tools how to deal with it in very different spatial contexts, but also national contexts where we have different housing situations, where we have different legal opportunities and so forth. So in Estonia, the topic of population decline has become more and more relevant, let's say, in the last 6 or 7 years. Of course, the national statistics mostly has been just putting together different prognoses showing how the population on a national scale changes. But then they have also now started to publish the change of population in the counties, for example. And here you see basically the estimation for 2045 with regarding all of the counties of Estonia, where you basically see that the growing ones are only Tartu and Harju, so the biggest two cities, Tartu and Tallinn, and their city regions, and all of the other counties, the population is declining. Another element of that is of course population which is also aging. So here we have the population pyramid of 2 of the municipalities that were also in the pilot study. And here you can also see that if you start to look at the population pyramid and also start to look at the long-term prognosis, so what is happening in the next 20 or 30 years, then there is a very big share of inhabitants who are in this, let's say, 55 plus or 60 plus age, who are, of course, very relevant currently in the, let's say, in the housing market, meaning that they occupy quite a lot of the dwellings in the area currently, but it's not very clear how them leaving, let's say, our realm and passing away will then start to influence the built environment of those areas, especially because we see that from underneath the younger inhabitants, there's not so many of them. And this is also the perspective which I think is the most difficult to understand for a lot of the municipalities that are dealing with this issue, because many of them are currently concentrating on different strategies to attract, well, mainly families with children, but they're not very much discussing also the difficulties of adapting their environment, first of all, for aging community, and then also to think about what happens then afterwards when this, let's say, the big generations who were born 50 and more years ago are passing away, and they are left with much smaller numbers of population. In Estonia, of course, it's not only about population decline, but it's also very much about unequal regional development, because after the re-independence of Estonia, of course, there's a very strong belief in different decision-making, on, especially in the national level, concerning different investments, that the market is leading the development. So the discussion that somehow regional development should be also steered more by the state, this has just become active conversation now in the recent years. These are scenarios which were prepared for the Estonian Human Development Report. There's a future chapter there. There's a link here as well, because the whole development report is in English. So these were the scenarios where we tried to also communicate better to the decision makers of Estonia. So, for example, the parliament and the other members of the state organizations for whom this report is mainly addressed to, that how the different decisions, not only as reaction to the population decline, but also concerning infrastructure, concerning how we develop the public space, and steer the regional development of Estonia will start to affect the country in the future. So these scenarios are for 2050, and you can see here very well on the upper part these current trends where you have this Estonia voluntarily forced into cities is basically the scenario which you can see from the current population prognosis, where you really have probably 3 big city regions, and it's not that nothing else is around it, but basically that it's only second houses or this entertainment area for then the city people who once a while go into nature or have their second homes or vacation homes outside the cities. And then, of course, industry and forestry and all of those activities. And this is becoming, unfortunately, more and more realistic. So when we have looked to the shrinking topic, of course, people tend to have this idea that the shrinking environment equals empty buildings. So that you can instantly see that, okay, this place is now empty and it's just filled with those buildings which are decaying slowly. And if we don't see it, then it means that it's not shrinking. Then everything is fine. So, of course, in Estonia as well, we have certain areas which have become, let's say, these sites for dark tourism, and many international bloggers going there and people from cities going there in the weekends to take cool videos in those ghost towns. So there are these cities. Of course, they're not all really completely empty. There are still communities living there in some parts of those areas, although the majority of those areas, like this Vivikonna, which is here with the red circle, in that area is indeed empty. And we also see another area from this region, which is on the upper right picture, this Oru area, where you see when you compare to the new maps with the old maps, that they have also demolished the area quite a bit. So this is actually a district or a city district actually officially, which is still very much active and working, although the number, let's say, of different services has decreased quite a lot. But what has happened here is, for example, that the buildings have been started to get empty from in the middle of the area. And since they have just demolished them as the buildings have gone empty, then it means that they have seriously injured, I would say, the whole urban fabric of that particular district, because it's hollowed out now from the middle. It's not, nothing is replaced there. It's very nice green area that is surrounding this district, but currently the core of the district is just empty. And then there are buildings all around where still some life is somehow happening. And then this is a slide now from the current analysis we're doing on a national scale about vacant apartments in Estonia. And just from these statistics, let's say if we talk about vacancy, every fourth dwelling in apartment buildings is currently vacant in Estonia. Every fourth. And then if you look at different counties, then these numbers differ quite a lot. So you have also counties where, for example, every third dwelling in apartment building is empty. And when you look also at more at the county level, then you see here that it's also quite different where those apartments are getting empty. So they are, of course, in majority of counties, they are empty in different cities, which are in that territory. But there are also counties such as Põlva, marked here, where it's also quite high amount of apartments being empty in villages. And there's also counties like Rapla, where there are mostly in small towns and not so many in cities or villages that are empty. And then, of course, shrinking does not always equal vacancy. So, of course, when we research vacant apartments, then apartments being vacant do not always mean that the area is shrinking. Shrinking is, in some sense, very complex phenomenon, or rather as a discourse, and the different parameters which are measured or researched within it depend a lot on the available data, and then they are combined of different aspects. So we have been looking and working quite a lot with the data regarding vacancy and trying to determine and understand further about is the vacant apartment empty, or is it just vacant time to time, or how is it used as second home or something else. So if it's vacant, but it doesn't mean that it's empty. And it's very hard to answer that question sometimes. And I will show you more now when we go to the pilot area regarding that. There is also abandonment, where apartments are left behind. There is, of course, the population aging and depopulation, which I discussed also previously about in the context introduction of Estonia. And there are, of course, then the economic activities. So usually related to the economic decline of the area, certain big companies closing off. Also, in many cases of the built environment, when certain companies have built big districts to house their workers who are all in the same age, and then the companies die off, and then also the workers are all in the same age group and decide to leave at the same time. So there are also these kind of links which are then becoming evident later on in the physical space, and we need to figure out, when we try to understand how and why buildings are then slowly emptying out or dwellings are becoming vacant. And of course, there's spatial dependence, which is happening in time. And that means that, of course, that some kind of change is done. For example, the population decline that we see from statistics, but then there's a certain delay how it happens in space. And it's not a linear, it does not happen linearly often. And then you need to find ways how to also look at it from a longer perspective, and how you can also maybe understand, I mean, theoretically in spatial conditions, there is this understanding that in the case of shrinkage, first one building becomes empty and then the other buildings around it start to become empty as well, because the whole neighborhood is sort of going down. But it is not always clear in which context this is actually true, or how much it is actually true in actual different spatial contexts. So this now was the introduction. Now I'm a little bit going to talk about what the state has done so far regarding the topic of shrinkage. So shrinkage as an, let's say, active topic from the state has been on the table, let's say, from the start of 2014. Also 2015 was the first guidelines. So 2050, they published the guidelines for planning of shrinking areas. And then also 2014, there was a launch of a Great Public Space Program. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on. But basically what it meant was that first of all, also on the state level, the topic of shrinkage started to become more and more relevant. There was one particular city, namely Valga in South Estonia, where there was a very active city architect who was encountering in his city those problems in his daily work, and who was also doing great work to, let's say, through his experience, bring that topic also to the National Architects Union and to the state level, and involve that into different discussions. Also, at the same time, the people in the Architects Union started to realize that the different city centers in small cities, in slightly bigger cities in Estonia, need help, especially with the quality of their public space, because in many cases they could observe, not by data, but let's say more by just observation and personal experience, and what the other city architects were saying, that the city centers were slowly starting to die out. And that does, of course, not mean shrinkage always, but there was very evident problem with the city centers emerging, which usually resulted from very bad planning decisions from earlier years, meaning that there were new developments which were built somewhere else than center, to the suburbs of the cities. The housing within the city center was not renovated or renewed. Often the small services disappeared from city centers, so there were shopping malls being built in the again in the suburbs or in very, very far outside the city center, which you entered by car. So it was very clear that the city centers in small towns needed to get more attention. So the public space program is then one of the projects which tries to offer some kind of tool to then deal with revitalization of those cities, especially through investment into public space. So, and currently this has been hugely popular also with the towns, because of course, in the beginning, the municipalities were a little bit hesitant to participate in it. It was not designed as this competition that let's make let's deal. It was not clearly said that let's now deal with the shrinkage cities and so forth. It was more presented at that time as a gift of, it was the centennial of Estonia, so 100 years since independence. So it was more this idea that let's now renew those city centers to and promote public space. But currently, I think this is one of the best mechanisms designed by state and also the Architects Union, where cities are actually invited to very closely analyze their built environment, and then to also strategically define in which kind of areas would they need this new public space to happen. So some cities have been using it to redo their main square. So this is the town of Võru in South Estonia, which used it to do the main square. In some cases, it has also been main streets or different kind of areas which are connecting key sites of the city in the city together. But overall, this is now, I think, the biggest kind of positive success story, because there's I think 30 plus competitions which have been held, and also 10 new big public space projects which have been built. And why I'm talking about this public space program is also because this year, now during Venice Biennale, this is actually the main topic of the Estonian Pavilion. And the pavilion and the exhibition there is called Positively Shrinking. So they are putting there together the revitalization of city centers together with the shrinkage topic of simultaneously then the city centers being in many of the Estonian cities the prime spots which are also getting empty, and where buildings are empty and buildings are also being demolished. And here you can also see the links to the materials of the Biennale. Okay, but then back to the state activities. So the Great Public Space Program and these guidelines were kind of first activities that were done, and now we're going, let's say, to the second stage, which more actively started with this pilot program. It was initiated late 2019 and carried out 2020. And the outcome of that was, it had several outcomes. So overall, it was led by Ministry of Finance. It was a pilot project and it had multiple different parts. I was only part of one team, which was then preparing the guidelines for analyzing shrinking environments and also adapting to shrinkage. I'm going to talk about that part of the project very soon. And then there were also other activities. So there was a legal analysis to understand further actually how could apartments from empty buildings being how could we transfer them to the municipality in order to actually demolish the buildings in the end, because one of the main issues with for the municipalities was that even if they could see that certain buildings need support, there were very unclear legal possibilities to actually do anything about that, or to relocate inhabitants, or to even demolish the building in the end. So basically the municipalities had no very good toolbox how to start dealing with the vacancy in the built environment. And the second part of that topic regarding the demolition of buildings and relocation of the inhabitants was also this participatory process design. So how do you actually talk to inhabitants about those issues, about shrinkage, but also about relocation? How to start discussing with the inhabitants of one building which is slowly emptying out, the different possibilities of relocation, and how to actually then complete the process. So the idea of the pilot was also to then make up an example of a couple of buildings in a couple of municipalities, how to steer that process successfully. Because what has been happening in the municipalities in previous years was that there were cases of some inhabitants who over a period of several years were forced to be relocated several times, because they were just relocated to another apartment and then that building got empty and then they had to relocate again. So that in the end just showed that actually for the municipalities, it was not really a point of just relocating them and demolishing the buildings, but the municipalities also very much needed to understand further what are actually the areas where to relocate. So you wouldn't have to repeat the process with the same people after every once in a while. Now going to this pilot project of the ministry that I was part of, then the start of the story was really abandonment. So what was happening within those municipalities and also with the vacant dwellings, which made the state very actively start to deal with that topic, was that there is an opportunity in Estonia, or at least very recently it still was, that if you didn't want your apartment, you could give it as a gift to the state. And suddenly the state noticed that they started to receive gifts from specific municipalities, and a lot of these gifts. So they started to have hundreds and hundreds of apartments given to them. And the owners of those apartments just leaving to live somewhere else. The reason for that was also that the apartments were not worth anything in terms of money, because the real estate prices in those areas were so low. And then after receiving so many apartments from certain regions, the state then felt that they had to somehow start to steer the process. So of course it was very much motivated by their need to somehow solve this problem of being given real estate, which they didn't know what to do with, but it now has evolved into something else, meaning that I think the Ministry of Finance and their real estate department has moved further away into kind of understanding that the municipalities rather need to be supported with abilities and tools and also data to not only adapt the built environment to shrinkage, but to actively kind of steer the process. And the state is now also realizing their role in how they could support municipalities in doing that. In the housing situation in Estonia, and I need to explain that before we see the analysis maps, and because in European context, in the different countries, the housing situation tends to be quite difficult, and this is usually also the most problematic part of using the shrinkage strategies of any other countries. For example, the East Germany examples of the 1990s have been quite extensively discussed in Estonia, but these are usually not applicable, especially because they have the ownership structure of the real estate is completely different. And in Estonian case, almost 90, so over 80% of the dwellings are owned by the owners. So there is no rental market, or there is very little, and mainly inside the big and the growing cities. So it is all ownership based, and of course also then the buildings themselves, big apartment buildings, are managed by the owners associations. So basically all of the owners of the apartment have to come together to make the decisions or to plan the renovation of the building and so forth. So it's quite complicated then to manage the buildings in some sense, and that also maybe explains further why it's so complicated for the municipalities to then somehow actively start to participate in not the housing market, but let's say for the example of demolishing the building, because they literally need to get the ownership of every single apartment in that building in order to actually do something with that building. Not even to maybe demolish it, but even to renovate it or turn it into something else. It's legally a very burdening process to start individually then discussing with all of the different owners. And then the second issue with the housing is that the building stock itself, and it's very clear from this graph that of course most of the building stock is from the Soviet era, so 1960s until 1990s. Very little built after that, not considerably more than before the 1960s. And there's two issues with that. One thing is that, of course, in the most of the regions with the declining population, no new buildings have been built almost at all. Mostly they are then private buildings, no new apartment buildings. And then the existing apartment buildings are all from 1960s to end of 1980s. So which means also that they are all now minimum 40 years old, most of them much older. They need to be renovated, but also this renovation process is not very actively happening. So our pilot area regarding this first state-led project is in the east of Estonia. We had two pilot areas, so there was two municipalities, a little bit different in their size, but also their building stock and settlement structure, meaning that we had one city which was comprised of 5 different city districts, and often also actually quite far from each other, so not kind of cohesively together. And we had another parish which had 2 bigger cities and but quite a lot of building stock which was private buildings. So in the case of the city, like 90% of the building stock was apartment buildings, and in the case of this other parish, there was considerably higher amount of also single family houses. And then there was a third pilot area which we didn't analyze, which was another associate who was working from South Estonia, which is in this Valga city, which I already mentioned, having a very active city architect. And I would say also that they are, I think, most exemplary of all of the Estonian cities with regards to drafting shrinkage policies at the moment. So they have like actually shrinking strategies, and they are kind of most active in not only dealing with adapting to shrinkage, but also kind of positively gathering attention and new resources to deal with the topic that they have at hand. But basically, these are the 2 areas that we were analyzing. And I think one of the important elements regarding those areas is also that the East Estonian region of is industrial area. So it's very comparable to the kind of area that Maurice was also introducing in his presentation regarding with the industrial past, because not all of the cities struggling with this topic in Estonia have that particular industry. But in East Estonia, it's especially mainly oil shale industry, which is now also of course, regarding the Green Deal and Green Turn and all of those topics needs to be redone and reimagined completely in the next couple of decades. And another specificity of this East Estonia is also that it has mostly Russian-speaking community, which were all people who were brought in during Soviet time from other parts of Soviet Union. So it's also ethnically quite special area in Estonia. But now to our analysis. So what we analyzed regarding the vacancy, I said we mainly, with the pilot area, worked with the data of the apartment buildings. We did not design decide in the beginning the data sets that we would like to work with ourselves. So that was already a preliminary task decided by the ministry, and they suggested that or invited us basically to investigate the different data sets they had or the state could obtain. And our job was to analyze them to further understand how much they could tell us actually about the shrinkage and why is it happening, and could this be possibly used as a model maybe to analyze also other areas in Estonia in a similar manner. So what we used was basically variations of the population registry where people basically tell us themselves or register themselves to a certain apartment, and this we got from a national statistics. And we also used the electricity data, so we could see also apartments which were empty in a sense of not even a fridge working basically, so where there was no electricity consumption. And these were the basically the results which how we started to compare these data sets. So trying to determine buildings regarding to their vacancy rates. So which are the buildings where over half of the apartments were empty, or even more than half of the apartments were empty. Were there any clusters that started to emerge, and so forth. And then we started to organize, of course, looking at the data on the map. It's one topic to see the different spatial clusters or certain areas where there's a more high frequency of buildings with high vacancy rates, but also we started to analyze more the building stock. So what type of buildings were getting empty. So it's quite complicated. No, it's not actually so complicated matrix, but basically we had to understand how to divide the building stock in a way that it would make sense to us. So we divided that by building age and then also by the building size to further understand then what types of buildings were left empty. But of course, also what type of apartments are empty, because, for example, with those specific pilot areas, it's very clear that since many districts and areas within the municipalities have, for example, building stock from 1980s, which are these very big apartment buildings, at least with 100 apartments, then of course, a lot of the vacant apartments are in those very big buildings in terms of sheer numbers. But of course, within those big buildings, they often are distributed between many of them. So they are usually not very visible. So the size is very big, but there are maybe like 20% of the buildings is vacant. And it little bit dependent the type of the dwelling, of course, on the municipality and district. So there were municipalities, for example, the Stalinist type of building from 1950s with up to 8 apartments was the type that was the most vacant usually. But it's very clear that while doing this analysis, it was also always very important not to look at just general statistics, but also trying to understand the the preferences towards living environment, and then also preferences towards certain buildings in the local context. So it was often quite different. As I said, there were some areas where the Stalinist building was not appreciated, not because of aesthetic reasons, but for example, because of bills, that it was just more expensive to heat it. And then there were other areas where it was more popular building, and these were not really concerns. There were also cases where these interesting data sets, which were very much to do with only that particular region. So we were giving, for example, data set of ghost owners, which means people who have apartments in Estonia, but do not have Estonian ID or residence permit. So they are just using it basically as a PO box. And especially interesting in the case of ghost owners is that, of course, there's no way to get to contact with them. So it's another kind of legal puzzle, how to even obtain that apartment from a ghost owner in case you would actually want to, again, do something with that building, change something within that building. And this is quite crazy case from Püssi city, where we found, for example, two big apartment buildings where half of the apartments were owned by ghost owners. So basically the whole building was almost a big PO box or post box of just obtaining a European or Estonian address, let's say, for the owners most likely, but there was nobody actually actively living there for sure. There were also cases where we compared the depths versus vacancy. Here you could also see quite interesting examples where, for example, from vacancy perspective, the situation with the buildings was very good, but from depth perspective, it was not so positive. So the building depths were actually quite high, which probably also then leads to think that in terms of long-term perspective and renovation of the building and maintenance of the building, it's not probably the best possible outlook. Here's just a little picture in between about the actual context where we worked in. So also my background picture, if you saw it from before, it's also from one of those apartments, which is currently abandoned and given to the state. And the buildings and interiors you see here are also these apartments which are empty. So overall, I showed you some different examples of the data sets that we analyzed, mainly, of course, determining from the focus of the building type and vacancy. But regarding then the vacancy prognosis and suggestions for the municipalities, as our task was in the end to also put together guidelines, we suggested them to look, of course, at a variety of different information in their municipalities. So the suggestion was to look at different categories related to space, so built environment, also different kind of values, which are not always tangible, and also different kind of activities and services which they had in the municipality. So our message to the municipalities was in any case to have a holistic picture when they are doing their, analyzing their built environment and putting together a strategy to adapt with shrinkage, that it would not be only about the buildings themselves. So here's an example that we did regarding the landscape analysis and its methodology also for those cities to determine the relationship between areas with higher landscape values and then the relation of that to the vacancy. Or we also, for example, analyzed address changes to further understand where people are then moving from those different areas where they have been moved in the past 10 years. So the main conclusion from that particular analysis was that it was only in that particular 2 municipalities, it was really only the apartment buildings which were getting empty, and actually all of the private buildings or single family buildings were not getting vacant at all. So there was very clear move from apartment buildings to single family houses. And getting to the outcomes, then yes, the strategy guidelines for the municipalities that we proposed were to analyze then the different categories. The state in this case is supporting them then with the relevant data sets, and then to start actually determining not the areas where that are getting more and more vacant, but especially to use then the data to determine the areas where to invest. So where are the best places, the most livable places, where are the places where you have the most active communities who you should nurture, and then based on that to start directing different investments. And of course, there's one more, and then regarding the buildings, to also make very clear prognosis in relation to the population decline, but also how the current vacancy of the buildings, to kind of seriously start discussing them, that if in 20 years, for example, we would have I don't know, 1,000 or 2,000 dwellings in apartment buildings that will be empty. So what does that mean? What kind of, not only in what kind of areas we want to direct investment, but what are then the buildings, say, we want to keep, or which are going to be attractive living environments where we want to put investments into. So this was an exercise to also visualize it then for the municipalities, what it actually means, this prognosis of apartments getting empty in terms of the actual building types that they have in their municipalities. And here's a variation also of the different scenario opportunities they could use then in their districts to start to understand which are the kind of core areas to further develop, and which are then the best areas to kind of slowly either give back to nature or to use for other functions. And then now to the end, because I'm already a little bit over time. So our next step after this strategy and guidelines that were made was that now the ball of regarding the shrinking activities was handled to the Ministry of Economy and Communications, because they are the ones who are mainly in charge of the built environment, especially the renovation strategy of the buildings. And currently we are now working with them on another project that is attempting to basically use the same data sets, but to and add additional ones to understand more, not about on a national context. So what can we say about actually very different municipalities all over Estonia regarding the shrinkage and regarding also the vacancy. And there our attempt is to change two things compared to what I just showed you before. So not only analyze apartment buildings, but also to analyze single family houses. So the same data sets, but also regarding single family houses. So we get a more clear outlook regarding the whole urban fabric, not only the apartment buildings. And then also we would like to take in the temporal aspect. So really look at how the data is changing throughout minimum 10 years. So we see certain patterns emerging of how the buildings and different territories are getting empty, not only getting a view of one particular year, and then we're not really able to say what is it the fluke or is it some kind of longer term development? And then finally some outcomes or insights or remarks from this process. So first of all, regarding the degrowth, as I said as a comment to Maurice's presentation as well, it's very difficult with the municipalities to talk about shrinkage or for them to accept degrowth. And with the state partners, of course, it also depends a lot, depending on the ministry, depending on the organization, what kind of words you should use to describe that. It's not an easy concept to explain. And especially for municipalities, it's very difficult to accept it and to start drafting even strategies how to adapt with it. So I said currently the state has been doing a lot of pre-work for the municipalities, but in terms of municipalities, there's maybe only 2 or 3 active ones who are actually dealing now with this topic. And then, of course, the municipalities are often also not so much to blame, because if we interview them, it's very clear that they are often very overburdened by everyday tasks, and then also the political cycles where the politicians don't think this is a very attractive topic to discuss with the public. And they are also not used to participate in shaping housing policy or dealing anything with the housing policy except for municipal housing. So they really don't have the tools or experiences to deal with that. And then, of course, the renovation of the buildings is additional complicated task, because here the owner should take care of that to increase the quality of the built environment and that particular building. But it's often very complicated for the owners to manage this renovation of the building, not even in terms of bureaucracy, but even because often they are the most, in those particular pilot areas, for example, they are the most vulnerable groups and very low income groups often. And there's also language issues there, which do not enable them to put together, for example, renovation application documents. So how to actually then achieve the renovation of the built environment in this aspect, it's a very big problem indeed. There was also some discussion before regarding locals. So when we have made interviews with locals, especially in this pilot context, there was quite extensive fieldwork and interviews done with the locals who are being relocated. And they, of course, know usually what is going on. So when politicians somehow often try to avoid this topic, the locals are usually very aware that it's a shrinking situation. But of course, the how they deal with it is very different. So of course, you have many who vote with their feet, meaning that they move to different areas or they tell their children to move somewhere else. But then we have also found communities who appreciate it because they get more space. So they can actually take over buildings. This is especially done with smaller apartment buildings and use that for their whole family. So they enjoy sort of the luxury of space, that this abandonment of space that shrinking essentially offers to them. And yes, finally, the state organizations, I think, have a crucial role in especially, of course, supporting with different kind of financial mechanism, but also regarding this project of actually understanding what is going on, because shrinkage is often a problem, or at least this vacancy of the buildings that is hidden. And as long as it's hidden, it can be ignored somehow. And especially I see an important role in the state organizations of actually helping to put the different data sets together and putting the data about it in the open, because that has also, at least in our work, often become an obstacle, that you should not talk about empty places or show that somehow in space, because it involves a lot of risks. But as long as we don't show it, there's also a lot of risks, just nobody doing anything. about that in the long run. Yes, so with those thoughts, I would like to conclude. Thank you for listening. And sorry for going over time.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Very interesting. Very interesting and rich presentation. Yeah, I think we can go quite straight to questions. Maybe yeah, there is Carlos Lamuela just had to leave, but there is one very good question from him in chat. And yeah, anybody is free to join. Also, Antti Salonimi, please, if you are still online, please join. So let's have a small discussion, and then we can open it to the audience. I would like to ask from this notion of smart trinkets and new policies. So obviously, this public space program is yeah, good example, like a best practice type of thing. It would be nice to hear a bit more about that. But could you comment a bit more broadly? I mean, what is meant by smart trinkets, and is there something else than the public space program that is active in Estonia at the moment?
I think when we had a discussion beforehand regarding what is growth, and Maurice said that it's about defining what growth is, and if it's in economic terms, then maybe that's not the growth we want. And I think it's a little bit the same with the smart topic, that often smart or smart with cities is defined from this technological innovation point of view. And I think it's also in Estonian context, there is often this technological determinism and hope that, especially when we now started our data projects, that from data you can just learn everything, that you just put it all on the map, and then we know what is shrinking, and we can, prognose it in next 10 years and 20 years and 30 years and know everything. So I think this is the problem with the smartness, that it's often just currently thought as data being collected, and that we're being able to make these very clever decisions then based on the data. I often get that feeling, at least from the ministry discussions with the client that we've been having. But I think the smartness is actually not so much there in the technology. That what we can see, the question of being smart is actually how you then start to how the municipality is able to actually cope with the change, direct the change, how they manage to foster these new collaborations, between different municipalities to begin with state, also with the local companies, also with the inhabitants. So for me, the smartness is really much about collaboration and communication, and then also trust between different partners, and much less in that sense about technology, because I see that this is the actual problem that they are having. They don't have a problem that there's not enough technology. There's just a problem of communication and strategic thinking in many ways as well.
Yes, yeah, that's true. I mean, this technological dominance, yeah, should be somehow, yeah, we should get rid of that way of thinking. Here in Finland, there is some discussion that okay, instead of exactly focusing on growth, we focus on well-being, for example. It's kind of reorienting them, the aim of policy and planning. Well, I have one question that I would like to pose to both of you, Maurice and Kristi. I mean, it's of course highly interesting to hear the story that people, or this let's say group of people occupying an apartment building, they just kind of leave, and they give the key to state, saying, okay, we leave and we give as a gift our empty building to the state. So it would be nice to hear this kind of actual context. I mean, how to undo real estate, how to undo the values that is embedded in buildings and real estate. It's of course very, very big part, and there's a lot of loss in some basic economic sense happening. So how is that dealt? How's that dealt in the Dutch context, and how is that dealt then in them? But what is the state then doing with those buildings it gets in Estonia? But maybe if we start from Morris, if a building is empty, how is that dealt in the sense of kind of governance and economy? Who takes the responsibility of taking the loss in the end?
Yeah, maybe first of all, I think compared to Estonia, the Netherlands has had a soft landing when it comes to demographics. So I don't think we have these extreme examples, like for example, Eastern Germany. So just to put it a bit in a context, but in my region, there was also a plan and a policy decision to demolish, I think, 11 or 12,000 social housing units. And this was basically 100% owned by housing corporations. So they obviously have these large social housing buildings where you at once can sort of demolish maybe 100 or 200 units at once. And this was actually done in not so much time, but after a few years after these units were demolished, things started to change, and then there was a shortage of actually social housing units. So very quickly it became a sort of opposite problem. Instead of having too much, there was actually a scarcity of affordable social housing. But obviously, when it is social housing, when it is housing corporations, when they own the housing, then it's basically public funding who enables the demolition of these units. And often this is, in the example of Superlocal, there is European money in it because they transform it into an experiment. It's much more difficult to make an intervention in areas where there is talk of private ownership. So then you have to negotiate, of course, with every individual owner to make a sort of impact in a certain neighborhood. So that's much more difficult. And I think in my city, they didn't succeed in making an impact in areas where there was private ownership at hand. At the same time, I think we are now seeing, so then you have the challenge of demolition, but also a lot of buildings, they just enter a phase of pause, so a phase where nothing happens with the buildings. And then you see, of course, that there are initiatives, citizen initiatives, who say, okay, there is an empty building, just give us the key and we make some program. But my expectations for these type of initiatives are also not we shouldn't overestimate these, because one of the characteristics of shrinking cities is that you have selective migration, of course. Of course, the cultural and intellectual young people who are known for these type of initiatives, they would be the first to leave a shrinking area. So you might have a lot of buildings and possibilities, and to quote Jane Jacobs, to put new ideas in old buildings, but you lack actually the very people who have the cultural and intellectual ideas to actually make these ideas happen. So we have a lot of buildings, but we lack actually the group of people who can make it happen. And then there is obviously the buildings who just stay empty for a while, and after maybe 10 years or 15 years, there is a new interest in the building and people are starting to occupy it again, or people see business opportunities in it. So But I would say the first part, so the investment from the public side, is obviously the deal maker when it comes to demolishing a large number of public housing to make the impact. That's the most impact, I think.
Yes. Okay. Thanks. How about Estonia? I mean, is there yet any evidence of, okay, state is getting building, so what next?
Well, I think in the pilot, the state understood their role as to use their ownership in a positive way. So if, for example, in a certain building already, state has a certain number of apartments, and then also the municipality usually acquires one certain number of apartments, then they can already start to lead the process in certain direction. So I think for at least the pilot project, the positive outcome that it was that state did not want to get rid of their apartments anymore, but rather understood that they could use the real estate to steer some kind of positive development, either with building or the district in that area. And as the next step, then they started mainly communicating with the municipalities, that the municipality would start also to keep the real estate that they received from inhabitants, because often it was also the case that the municipality received the real estate in form of apartments, but then they would just auction it off. So there was actually no way then for the municipalities to steer any kind of development in the areas or start to decide where they would like to see changes happening, or which buildings they would like to then see demolished. And that has been actually a huge change, I think, in Estonia, both for the state level and municipal level, because you saw that with the after the independence, it has not seen as a positive sign for state and the city to own apartments or own housing at all. So it has been really small shares, and the fact that they are now starting to think of it as part of their strategic activities, this is already quite a big change. So and of course what we were discussing quite a lot was also like every time you do something in some sense negative in the shrinking environment, like demolish a building, that should always be balanced with some other positive investments into that environment. And of course, from state and municipality side, they have now a renowned interest in municipal housing or rental housing, because often in those shrinking areas, it is also an issue that they cannot get high quality specialists to come in. For example, there has been discussion about teachers in schools, because they cannot find apartments which would be attractive or suitable for them, or also how to develop buildings for families in the cities. So they would not have these situations where all the families move to suburbs or some kind of other small villages into the private houses, but they would rather find good living conditions also in city centers that would kind of mix the benefits of single family housing and let's say townhouse or something like that. So yes, I see it currently as a very kind of positive change, especially from state side, but I hope now with state-led initiatives, the municipalities will also follow, that they are actually starting to see a role for themselves in the housing market, that it's not the market business all the time as it was before.
Yes, exactly. I think there is something very interesting in this idea that, exactly as you said, you get single family house conditions or qualities in a, let's say, town center. If there's a Stalinistic small apartment building completely empty, so then you get whole space for your own family. I think that's exactly something that Maurice, you said, that this shrinking context is some kind of testing ground for something new. I think both of you said very clearly that the local municipalities, they don't want to even accept shrinkage, and they don't see it as positive, like Morris started from the fact that degrowth thinkers are in the growing big cities in Barcelona, and then they don't know about the actual shrinking context in the industrial areas of Europe. But having now already quite a long experience of that, so is there any change in the sense of what the cities, the political community or politicians think in the Dutch context?
Yeah, I can remember some discussions I had 10 years ago with local politicians where they said to me, well, don't use the word shrinkage because it's negative, etc. I can also remember the Shrinking Cities project from the German Shrinking Cities project from architect Philip Oswald, which had their presentation and also exhibition in 2008 that I'm not sure, I think in Duisburg they wanted to host this exhibition, but the municipality said, no, we don't want it because it puts a stigma on our city. And so it's always a balance between trying to avoid to get this stigma, because I mean, in this group, probably we will think and discuss the topic of shrinking cities and degrowth in a very nuanced manner. But in general, I think still the public opinion on cities that do not grow and shrinking cities is often related to vacancy, to empty buildings. And in general, I don't think politicians or policymakers don't want to be associated with these type of negative images. At the same time, after 10 years of organizing lectures and symposia and publications, I think there is quite a shift in the way people think about the phenomenon of shrinking cities. That has, I think, to do with the fact that there has come into existence some form of a culture of degrowth. So we have developed a vocabulary to pinpoint this phenomenon. We have developed ideas, we have developed perhaps also some alternative strategies, and we also found maybe some rituals, like if in the Netherlands, at least in the Netherlands, this is a ritual. If you have reached the highest point of a new building, then you celebrate this, but you can also celebrate the fact that you demolish a building because it has lost its function. So maybe instead of an old building, you get more green space. So these symbols and these rituals and this vocabulary, I think, contributes to understand this as not a per se a negative phenomenon. So I think in 10 years, I think the perception of shrinking cities has changed. And I think we can now have a good discussion on how to cope with this and to talk about urban development in cities that do not grow without having to deal with this stigma or image or sensitiveness of politicians who don't want to touch the subject. So, but it may take some years to get there. Antti, I see your finger or a hand, maybe.
Yes, yeah, exactly, thanks. Let's very soon move to general questions, but if Antti Saloniemi, if you're still online, I would really like to invite you to comment from the point of view.
Yes,
but
thank
also
you.
More broadly, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those stimulating presentations. I think we should have a whole evening to discuss on these topics. But I'm just continuing what Morris said, and I'll be a bit provocative. So just recently we had municipal elections here in Finland, and it was nearly tragical to notice that each local politician from each scrappy municipality or little town, so their key message was that we must have growth and we must be attractive. But, as this is my provocation, the reason why they were seeking growth and to be attractiveness, it was not the case that they were so very keen to this capitalistic consumption culture. So that was not what they were seeking for, and what was their concern or panic. So their panic is just this decline in tax revenues. And why it is so crucial is that because it is much to do with this demographical structure, which most of those little municipalities, it's very, very unfavorable. And still the municipalities and towns, they have to take care about social and healthcare. And they are not asked if they will or not. They must do it. And that is the reason why they are so eagerly and tragically seeking growth and new working place. And so before we can get some solution about this reason to seek the growth, I think this discussion, I understand very much that this kind of discussion about this degrowth or shrinking, it's not very easy to sell, because they are just immediately asked that, please, well, tell us then, how do we get our tax money to keep healthcare centers and schools and daycare centers running? And so I think it's a bit too simplified to just reduce this growth and capitalistic consumption, for example, in this kind of circumstances we have in Finland.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, do you want to comment, Kristi or Maurice? The funding base for the services is a bit different in different countries. That makes some difference. Here it's very much based on the municipality.
Yeah, and if I have right, for example, in the Netherlands, the situation is a bit different.
Maybe Kristi, you would like to comment first?
Yeah, I mean, I can give some thoughts first. I think, of course, this is very, very true. At the same time, you have these schizophrenic situations in the municipal development plans, which I have been reading through, where they first have a big chapter on population projections, which are super detailed and which meticulously show how it is decreasing exactly. And then they just continue with their usual investment plan. So those two parts, also in the strategy documents of the municipalities, which are essentially their investment plans, they do not have any dialogue currently. So it's not even in that sense calling something shrinking or degrowth or something, but from somebody who is outside, but it's also within the municipality currently the process of, for example, putting together the strategy documents, where it's kind of schizophrenic document in itself, which is not taking into account the two parts of the discussion. First of all, very clearly demonstrating how it is declining, and then not discussing how this is actually affecting the investments. I think another question here with the municipality income, which has been discussed in Estonia, is to have this second home tax, not to the people, but basically that people would have a possibility to give some of the income also based on where they have their second home, or where would they like to have their income given. For example, a municipality where they once lived or came from, or which they cared about, or where their grandparents lived. But this is currently not possible. You need to choose. And this is, of course, quite a lot debated. And then it's very much, let's say, lobbied by the big wealthy growing cities, that of course this system would not be changed, because they would be the ones then to suffer from that if there would be a redistribution of taxes. So maybe this is not a solution for all of the municipalities, because not all of the municipalities have a big share of second homes. But this is a solution for quite many of them, from some perspective at least. And then finally, I think there's also a discussion regarding the state role in organizing different activities. I understood from the Ministry of Communication last time that they are also planning to do one survey about different state organizations in the future, regarding actually what kind of indicators they then take into account when they decide upon the service network. So for example, the school network or the hospital network, or also with the state companies like the postal services, so how they distribute their services, because we can do, of course, all sorts of things regarding the strategic planning of shrinkage on the level of built environment, but then somebody else comes from some other ministry and closes off certain vital services at the same time, or reorganizes the school system, and then that of course will have a major impact on the built environment and the building vacancy and all of those elements in a while. So, and this has not been really discussed. It has been very kind of Excel sheet led decision making, and not very much discussed the distribution of services from the perspective of the same regional development, that it's actually balanced somehow.
True. Yes, good. In chat, there are some questions, yeah, about the public space program. For example, maybe we can take that at the end. Did you have, Antti, some other thoughts about these cases?
Well, perhaps another question. My main thought is a bit more conceptual. This was so extremely interesting to listen to this presentation where this phenomenon shrinking was in the focus, and still, it is self-evident that the institutional environment in Estonia and in the Netherlands, it's totally, or not totally, but very much different. And so I start to think that how is it about this concept shrinking? How much does it explain impact? Or is it just this environment where everything is, and now I mean this institutional environment. So how does it, how should I put it? So what's in common with this phenomenon which we are addressing, shrinking in Estonia and in the Netherlands?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe I also can react shortly on your previous question, Antti. And then I should leave in 5 minutes, I think, the meeting, because the dinner is prepared by my wife and it will be ready, I think, in 5 minutes. So I hope you can excuse me. But of course, there are a number of real problems, because also in the Netherlands, municipalities are funded by the number of inhabitants that live at a certain moment in that municipality. And I think in the Netherlands, this is called friction costs. So if you have a decreasing number of inhabitants, then still you need to pay for your infrastructure, for the street lights, for the educational buildings, etc. So if, for example, a school has, let's say, 100 less pupils, they will get also less funding, but still the costs for maintaining the buildings, etc., will and also for the staff So there is a lag. You can only change your staff in a matter of years. And we also have some problems in our system. So in the Netherlands, it's actually beneficial tax-wise to leave your property empty. So you can declare all kinds of costs that you have because of the fact that your property is abandoned. And in Belgium, they are smarter than you. In Belgium, you have to pay tax if property is empty after a certain amount of time, for example, 3 months. You also have the problem with infrastructure. I visited, I think 4 years ago, a small town in northeastern Germany. And they had the problem that the infrastructure, the sewage was actually, the pipes of the sewage, they were too big. The number of inhabitants that used the water and the sewage system were too little to make it function. So it didn't function anymore. So you have all kinds of absolute problems, I think. You have also the problem that maybe not so much the quantity when you talk about education, the quantity, the number of pupils, but also the diversity of education, of course, will be under pressure if the number of pupils is declining. So there are, of course, different kinds of problems. And then maybe a bit onto to your second question. I don't know exactly how to answer your question, but I think in the general perception of what a shrinking city is, people have these sort of common images. I mean, a lot of people, for example, tend to think of Detroit, and I mean, everybody has this image of Detroit as this sort of grandmother of urban shrinkage, and this phenomenon of ruin porn that all kinds of people, photographers, video makers are attracted also to this decay, this urban decay. I mean, it has a certain aesthetics, and I think the aesthetics of vacancy and urban shrinkage, that's, I think, one of the common features that attract a lot of people to this phenomenon. So that would be maybe the first. Maybe Christy, you can add to that, or Panu.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, there's. I mean, I personally, we of course, as prep work in terms of literature review, we have compared also the different strategies in different countries. I think the complicated part of that, also even in comparing European context, is of course that all of these cases are also happening in different times. So I already brought that example before, that usually, at least in Estonia, the East Germany cases are the most known often. There are also more discussed often. I already brought the example that there the kind of housing management system and ownership system is completely different. But at the same time, also things are happening in different eras. So how much can you compare the strategy of 1990s from East Germany and adapt that to Estonia, considering that well, it's a nice strategy, but also the times are now quite different. So it's like 20 years has passed. So should we now think about certain things quite differently? And I think it's especially complicated when it comes to built environment, because there's a lot of these regulations involved, and the living environment is very much also about the culture. So people are used to living in certain ways, and their expectations also towards the living environment change very rapidly. I think it's easier often to compare. When we did, for example, the pilot project, there were analysis of especially from strategies dealing more with participation and citizen involvement. And there you could instantly get a lot of inspiration and different ideas which you could transfer quite easily. But I don't think this is only a strategy, shrinking topic, but I think I'm overall a little bit critical with many of the kind of urban strategies or different trend topics or activities which are just imported from other cities or other countries without thinking about that local context. So I think we also then have to be careful in what kind of examples are being brought in. From the economic point of view, I forgot to mention that before, but one of the main activities that the Ministry of Finance now did was they got funding to order a report regarding shrinking policy suggestions from OECD. So this is now also an Estonian report from OECD, which will come out probably in the beginning of next year.
Okay, I have to leave, so I would like to say goodbye to you all.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Maurice. I think we start to wrap up. There is one small thing I would like to still kind of 2 minutes to continue, but thank you very much, Maurice. It was very interesting material, and maybe we do our degrowth magazine also in Finland. Who knows? Let's see.
Yeah, who knows? It would be nice.
Touch,
So,
let's keep in touch.
thanks for inviting me, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Yes, bye-bye. Yes. So just to continue a bit, so there is Katja Rodionova asking about shrinking construction business. I think it's quite clear. I mean, that's the point what Antti you brought, that the municipalities they're kind of tied to a certain level of funding, certain flow of money, because you need to keep the institutions alive, the workers getting their salary. And clearly, well, no company wants to grow small. Every company wants to grow bigger, of course. I mean, it's the whole economy is and our society is very, very deeply linked to growth. And I think that's why this discussion is it is difficult. I mean, how to it is a big change, and that's why it's good to think about that. I mean, we are needed to think that at least the possibility and what it could be. But I think it came quite clear today. I mean, we didn't get really answer to the question: do we need growth? Because, for example, the Dutch case, of course, as a country, Netherlands is there is even still rather substantial economic growth and also population growth nationally, and then these shrinking areas of Netherlands, in some sense, it's a local issue. There is state subsidy, EU subsidy, and so forth. And even Estonia, of course, I mean, you can comment, but I think that the shrinkage is not a major issue, partly because of EU funding. I mean, there is always this kind of shoulder to somehow tackle the most urgent problems. So it's not really an existential question. That's at least my impression. But so we are dealing with the scales. This idea, Antti, in chat about the transactions, it's true. I mean, like VAT, there is this idea of decoupling material growth from economic growth. And exactly, if you just sell the same phone, this and that, so there's out of VAT, and there is no more physical production. I mean, it could be, but of course, there's much more work to be done to make it specific and somehow realize that. But exactly, I think we need many different approaches to start to unfold, because as Kristi showed in the beginning, population-wise, if things don't change very much, at least population will be going down in whole this kind of part of Europe in a way, Sweden, Finland, Baltic states, Poland. So there is very likely a quite substantial reduction of number of people at least. And I would remind what Indi Johar said in the first talk, that we don't have growth, in fact, anymore. and he wasn't very specific. Is he talking about the world or about Europe? But basically, the idea is that growth that we can measure in gross national production is only population growth. So if you get more people like Britain, there's immigration to Britain, and then very big part of the economic growth is linked to that. That was one statement. So there is certain complexity to that. But yeah, interesting discussion. Again, many thoughts. What is definitely now bugging me is this question of what words we are using, what are the concepts, what are the narratives and visions, and we didn't have time to really go in that, but this notion of right sizing is there. I think it's a bit American term. There is the notion of growing small. So obviously there is the word growth, which is positive, and small is always nice. So growing small, popper and popper, small can be beautiful. So there is really kind of complex terrain of that that naming of it, and then when that's linked to the geographic complexity from EU down to a neighborhood. So it's not easy to really get on same plane of discussion sometimes with these topics. Good. Let's finish with last words. So I would like to give last sentence to Kristi and to Antti, and then yeah, we start to close this session. Katja is liking, Antti, your idea of this service intensity intensification. Let's try that through.
Who will start?
Well, you can start, because I think I have not very much more to say at this time of evening about this enormous issues.
Yeah, I think we're all quite fried because
Yeah.
it's
That's
quite
again one
late,
of the long days.
but yeah, no, I just started thinking that when I'm talking about often the shrinking strategy and adapting the built environment to shrinkage, and then there's also often the kind of expectation that it's, I don't know if it's even an expectation, but there's of course many elements in that which is just, you know, regular good urban planning and urban strategy. So there are only some elements there which you need to consider in a different way. And I think a lot of this discussion is often the same discussion we have about good public space and buildings and everything else also in I'm not saying growing cities, but every city or every settlement in that kind of way. And I think it's not very clear still what exactly is the kind of degrowth or the shrinking element in all of that. And I'm still trying to figure that out. Of course, in Estonia, regarding the whole degrowth topic from the perspective of sustainability, now, of course, in East Estonia, because of the oil shale industry, there is a lot of fear. There is a lot of anticipation because of people understand things have to change. And I think this is also quite wonderful opportunity then to kind of find completely new futures for the area. But in terms of, let's say, planning the built environment, there I think the sustainability discussion in Estonia is just starting. For example, what kind of materials we use, or how do we minimize, or like Maurice brought the example that an architecture office who is not building buildings at all. This is still, you know, very out there for most of the building people. That I think one of my main dreams, at least from the perspective of built environment, is that we would need much more examples in terms of how to rebuild the existing buildings, how to adapt the floor plan to changing living preferences, how to innovatively reuse the materials. this is what I see as a challenge from Estonian system, that there are like some master theses time to time which are dealing with this topic, or we are doing student workshops, but there's no critical and serious thinking over that currently. It's kind of still this waste culture that let's just demolish and then move on to something else. So maybe these are my concluding words or themes that I would like to further think about or figure out.
Yes, great. Very interesting. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Kristi. Really rich material. We continue discussion next week. The topic is energy. Is the aim of zero energy, zero carbon on urban level possible at all? We have 3 speakers from the private sector. Tonu Pasanen, Niklas Salomaa, and Päivi Puntila from different new companies working with these issues, energy and carbon accounting, and then Kati Vierikko from Syke, from the State Environmental Institute, will join and talk about exactly where actually Kristi you ended. What is circularity in the urban scale? So that's next week, 7th of October, and we start at 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock launch, 4:15. The first speaker, Niklas Salomaa, will start. We will update those names to the EICAN website tomorrow. There is a bit missing names at the moment regarding next week. Thank you, Antti, for joining.